Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really well. Today's video is going to be a little bit different, as you can probably tell. So we had renovations done in November, and then we were sick in December, and so our house is pretty much completely empty. We have a bed and my desk, which is where I'm at now, but there's basically no furniture, so I have no setup for filming. So hopefully that's not too distracting in this video. It's not going to be the highest quality video or audio ever, but hopefully you guys still like it. I wanted to get it out rather than wait until I had more time to sort of polish it and polish my setup, because it is about New Year's and New Year's resolutions and how we can improve as writers in 2024. So I did not want to wait anymore to get it out for you guys. So today we are going to be talking about what you can sort of do to make big strides in your writing abilities in this year, in 2024. So maybe you've been writing since you were a teenager or since your early 20s. Maybe now you're 25, 35, 55, 75, and you still feel like you haven't really improved all that much, or at the very least, you're not where you want to be as a writer. So you haven't really arrived yet as a writer. You're not really producing work that you're super happy with, or maybe your goal is publication and you still have not achieved that goal. So there's going to be some sort of tough love elements to this video, but mostly it's going to be practical advice. I am going to break it up into 3 sections. So we're going to talk about mindset shifts, your writing process, as well as some writing skills. All are things that will help you, even though maybe mindset stuff and process stuff seems less practical. I promise all of these tips are very usable and will really make a difference in your writing abilities, and hopefully will help you to have the best year of writing improvement that you've ever had. So without further ado, let's get into the tips. Part 1, improve your mindset. So we spend a lot of time on this channel and in general talking about specific skills and specific ways to improve our writing. We don't think a whole lot about mindset, and I think that's because we just sort of assume that that's not that big of a factor. I think we just assume that your skills will speak for themselves, or that your skills can overcome any poor mindset that you might have. But I would really encourage you to examine your mindset and how you think about writing, because I think that can have a major impact on how often you write, how you feel when you write. So if you have a miserable time when you're writing, you're not going to want to write. So I think having a good mindset that helps you to stay positive and happy and engaged when you're writing is going to encourage you to keep writing. I also think mindset can really help us with following through and finishing projects. So the first mindset shift that I recommend that you take on or you consider is to think of writing as a skill and not a talent. So writing is a form of art. To get better at any art form, we have to work at it. We have to develop skills. So there is some degree of natural talent. We all have some degree of natural talent. Some of us have a lot of natural talent, but it's a pretty small amount of people. It's pretty rare that someone has a lot of artistic natural talent. I think it's maybe extremely rare for someone to be naturally talented at novel writing, because I think novel writing is a very big, long story. I think you could be more talented at short form writing inherently. I think to be inherently talented at something as long form as novel writing, it'd be very unusual. So I think a lot of us can put pressure on ourselves, expecting us to have more natural talent than we do, or we might even be a little bit in denial, wanting to believe that we have more natural talent than we actually do, because it kind of sucks to realize that you don't have a lot of natural talent. And I completely relate, because I do not consider myself to be someone who has natural talent at novel writing. I really struggle to understand all of these concepts. That's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about teaching these concepts to all of you guys, is because I worked really hard to understand them, and I really struggled with the way that things were explained. I really struggled with understanding what things meant, and when people talked about structure, and when people talked about scene structure and character arc, I really struggled to understand what they meant. And I wanted to be able to help other writers out understand things or have a little bit of an advantage in understanding things over me. So I try to explain things in a way that I think would have made sense to me then before I understood things. But anyway, I say all that just to say that even people who you might think have natural talent don't necessarily have natural talent. And I'm one of those people where maybe people would assume that I have natural talent. I don't. All of my accomplishments were very hard won. All of my understanding of novel writing was very hard won. So I did have those days where I thought I didn't have enough talent and that this just really isn't for me. And I just don't want you guys to feel that way, because you really can get your skills up to where you want to go. I did eventually come to understand stories and novel structure and character arc and all that, which you can tell obviously, I guess, because I run this channel. So you definitely can too, even if it feels hopeless, even if you feel like you just don't have enough talent. You absolutely can get there, and I assure you, if you put the work in, you will get there. As fun as it would be for all of us to have that natural talent and be able to write perfect novels the first time, and for all of us to just get published at our first try, as awesome as that would be, it's just not realistic. But if you want to get better as a writer and you put the work in, you really will get better. You really can overcome any limit to your natural talent. I can speak to that as someone without natural talent. I assure you, you can overcome it by learning. So I do think that it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because I think sometimes saying I'm just not good at this can be a way to avoid doing the work. And when you take that away from yourself and you don't let yourself say that, and you don't let yourself just throw in the towel and say, okay, I'm just not good at this, I just don't have talent in this. When you don't do that, you force yourself to actually do the work, and the work can be a lot. And that's where the sort of tough love comes in with this video, is you have to put in the work. You have to put in the time. You have to say, okay, I'm going to take on this growth mindset. I'm going to believe that I can get where I want to go. I'm going to believe that I can be the writer that I want to be, that I can write, whatever it is you want to write. Maybe you want to write really twisty, tight, exciting thrillers, but you can't plot anything right now. Or maybe you want to write really beautiful lyrical prose, but all of your writing just sounds terrible. No matter where you're starting, no matter where you want to go, I assure you, you can get there if you put the work in. So I just want you guys to have that mindset shift going into 2024. Writing is about skill. It is not about talent. And often people actually, a fun fact, often people who are talented are surpassed by people who put in more work, because talented people aren't used to putting in the work and they're used to just being good at things inherently. So often those of us who struggle more actually excel above people who have natural talent. So don't worry about it if you don't consider yourself to be somebody who has natural talent. So the second mindset shift is to put your vision above your emotional attachment to your work. So many writers, probably most writers, especially early on, I think, and especially with passion type projects, feel very, very close to certain aspects of their work. They're very attached to certain characters, certain scenes, and they might really struggle with cutting or removing things that maybe don't really work or don't align with their vision. So when we want to improve our work, we don't want to be stuck in that emotional attachment that prevents us from making edits that are in the best interest of our vision, because our vision is part of us. Our feelings and emotional attachment to the work is part of us, but the vision is something that we can bring across to other people. Our emotional attachment to our work might not come across to others. It might not come across to readers. So we might absolutely love a character or absolutely love a plot twist. Readers might not see that and might not care. So the vision is so much more important. So I want to encourage you all to try to focus more on your vision. So maybe you want to ask yourself, what do you want to say to the reader? What do you want readers to take from this story? What message do you want to bring across? What kind of tones and themes and ideas are important to you? Not which ones you feel the most emotional attachment to after you've written them, after they're already on the page, because I think as writers, we tend to, or not all writers, but most writers, I think, tend to get a strong emotional attachment once something's on the page. So instead of at that point, more try to step back and just think about the idea itself and what vision you have for the type of book that this is going to be and the type of message and vibe that readers are going to get and experience through it. Sometimes you might have a scene, for example, that is wonderful, you love it, it just speaks to you on some deep level, or you just love the way that you wrote it. But even though you're really happy with the scene, it doesn't really fit your vision. For example, maybe you wanted to write a really tightly plotted, intense thriller, and this scene is slower and emotional, and it kind of disrupts the pacing, and it doesn't really work where it's placed, but you can't really move it, but you really, really like it. If you let that emotional attachment get in the way of editing, what will happen is you'll end up trying to sort of work around keeping this. So you'll keep editing and editing, trying to keep this scene in, trying to make the pacing work, trying to sort of force it to function within your vision. That can be very disruptive to the editing process, and it can also really mess up your intuition. I think our emotions, our emotional attachments can get in the way of our intuition about story, probably more than anything else, because again, it's coming from us, the same place the vision is coming from, and it can be difficult to sort of parse out which thing we're experiencing. And sometimes that really comes down to improving your clarity on what your vision is, and also being able to remove emotions from the equation while still keeping your eye on the vision. And that can sometimes require that we make that vision more literal. So maybe you need to write down this specific vision that you have in a way that lets you interpret it more logically instead of more emotionally. It's impossible to effectively edit if you put emotions above your vision, because you're going to keep making bad choices to keep things that you like that aren't necessarily going to translate into something meaningful for the reader. If this does sound like something that you struggle with, something that I would recommend is making separate documents and treating the editing process as more playful and less definitive. So save the version with all the things that you feel emotionally attached to, and then save a separate document and take that scene out. Try to get some space from it if possible. Try to detach emotionally from it if possible, and try to read it honestly and openly as if that scene that you took out never existed. It is not in this current reality. Just read the story the way that your intuition edits it, or the way that, if you're a structural person, the way that you know it should fit in structurally, and try to let go of that scene that you feel so emotionally attached to. Often doing this, saving different versions, can help eliminate some of that anxiety and that fear of cutting things that you really like or that you really feel strongly about. So that's something that I recommend giving a try if this is something that you struggle with. Once you see how certain types of edits really benefit the book and really bring that vision to life. So you might have never experienced your own vision truly coming to life if this is something you really struggle with, among many other things. But if this is something that you really struggle with, you may have never seen your vision come to life, and this might be the first time you really get to see what it's like when every scene and every character and every aspect of the book really conveys your vision. So mindset number 3 is don't blame the story idea, blame your skill level. So this is where some little bit of tough love is going to come in with this video. Often writers hit a wall. Sometimes it's during plotting, sometimes it's during editing, could be during writing. And it's pretty common for writers to hit that wall and believe that their story is the problem. So instead of thinking, I've hit this wall, what am I not getting? What am I not understanding about structure, scene structure, character arc, what have you? They blame the story. So they say, this just isn't the idea. This just isn't the one. This isn't going to be my debut. This just isn't it. The problem is, most commonly when that happens and you give up on a project and you start another project, it's going to happen again with the next project and again with the next project. And it's going to keep happening with every project, because it's not the project that's the problem. It's the skills that you don't have that are the problem. It's a lack of skill in 1, 2, 3, 10 different areas. And that's what's causing you to give up on these ideas. And often you can tell because you will run into problems at about the same point. So often that's around the 20-25% mark, or around like the 40 to 50% mark. That's usually where we see people giving up on novels over and over and over again. And that really speaks to either poor planning, if planning is something you need to do. Poor concept of story structure could also be the culprit there. But typically, we're looking at a problem with skill. It could also be a problem with voice. You look at it and you don't like the voice. You don't like the way it sounds. You don't think the point of view, maybe you change the point of view because you think that the point of view is the problem. When you are in a mindset of this is the problem, the story is the problem, the voice is the problem, the character is the problem, those things are going to keep being problems over and over and over, and just dropping this project and picking up another project, it's not going to fix the problem. It's not going to get you further in your skill level. It's not going to improve things for you. So I would encourage you to try to shift your mindset so that rather than blaming the story idea, you blame your skill level and you try to really analyze where and how you could improve. That's not to say that you can never ever give up on a project. There are some projects that probably aren't worth continuing on. If you really realize you have no vision for this project or you don't like it at all, you can always give up. You don't have to push through on a project. I just would encourage you to believe that if you did stick with this project, you could finish it, and to make the choice to abandon it rather than fall into that belief that someday you're going to find the right project and all of your problems with writing are just going to disappear. The fourth mindset is if it works, it works. A lot of writers are concerned about the right way to do things. I get a lot of questions about whether it's okay to edit as you go, to do a fast draft, whether it's okay if you plot or okay if you don't plot. These things don't matter. So if these things work for you, that's great. If they don't, that's great too. But there is no right way or wrong way. What you should be focusing on is whether or not it actually works for you. A novel is a really big project, and we're not all going to tackle that project in the same way, and that's completely fine. People can give well-meaning writing advice, but that doesn't mean that it's going to work for every person. So no matter who gives the advice, whether it's me or anyone else, always keep that in mind, that we all think different, we all function differently, and there is no one size fits all writing advice, and some of the conventional advice might work for some people, it might not work for other people. So it's completely fine to do whatever you want, even if your process is sloppy and ugly and messy and you do a lot of flip-flopping back and forth between editing and writing, and it just doesn't have that smooth, clean look that maybe we sort of imagine or envision a professional writer's process to have. Really, really don't worry about it. If it works, it works. That's all that I want you guys to be concerned about. We do want to balance efficiency, so how long it takes us to do something and how much progress we're making in that time. So we don't want to, for example, be spending 50 hours on a single scene. We want to balance that though with quality. So we also want what we write to be good. So a lot of writing advice tends to prioritize efficiency. So for example, if you write a rough draft all the way through and then you write the second draft all the way through, or edit the second draft and then the third draft, and also if you work big to small, so big picture issues down to small issues, that's more efficient technically, but that doesn't necessarily mean the output is going to be of a higher quality. So for some people, rewriting a scene 15 times, it doesn't sound efficient because it isn't efficient. But when we talk about balancing efficiency and quality, for some people, rewriting the same scene 15 times is going to result in higher quality writing than if they had better planned the scene, written it in the rough draft, redid it in the second draft, redid it in the third draft. I hope that makes sense. I just want you guys to know that what works for you, and that's what's important. It doesn't have to actually be efficient. It doesn't have to look nice, and it doesn't have to fit into a romanticized view of what the writing process should or could look like. So all of this leads us to part 2, which is improving your writing process. So we don't often think about the process of writing as being significantly important. We tend to think more about the skills themselves. We might even think, and I know when I was younger, I used to think that a good writer could write a good story under any circumstance. So whether they were given the craziest prompt ever and, had to write a story in an hour, or they, spent 10 months writing, their masterpiece. I used to feel that there was an inherent goodness and inherent good quality that would always come through under any circumstances, no matter the conditions or the process that, the writer took on. But the actual process of plotting or not plotting, editing, writing, that is all vitally important to the final product. It's also vitally important to actually sticking with a project and actually finishing something. Because when we use a process that's not suited to us, we have a tendency to not follow through to the end and to not actually finish those projects. So a whole lot of success is showing up and actually doing the work, but we want to be doing that work in the right way, in a way that works for us. So that brings us to tip 1, which is figure out a process that actually works for you. So one of the biggest reasons writers don't progress with their skills is that they're making things harder on themselves from the get-go. They're trying to go about things in a way that doesn't vibe with their brain. It doesn't work with how they conceptualize story. And overall, it's just making the process difficult. It's like wearing someone else's clothes. There's no reason to try to fit yourself into something that isn't made for you, that isn't right for you. So personally, when I help writers figure out a process that will work for them, I use a categorization system where there's 4 types of writers. If you've been on the channel for a while, you've probably seen my 4 writer types video series. So there's a video that goes over the types in general, and then there's a video for each of the types that goes over the writing process that works best for those types. You can always fall in between types. This is just a way that I help to narrow down what type of process will work best for a writer. So that's something that I recommend that you check out. But just to go over it briefly, there are 4 types of writers in the system that I developed, and that is plotter versus pantser. So a plotter being someone who plans the plot of the story in advance, and pantser being someone who flies by the seat of their pants or wings it, who doesn't do plotting before they start writing. The second continuum is intuitive versus methodological. So intuitive is when you feel out the process, you feel out what works for the plotting, what works for the characters. You don't use any worksheets or methods. You just go based on intuition. And then methodological is using those processes, worksheets, structural systems, things like that to edit, write, plot any of the phases of the process. So those are the 2 continuums, and from those 2 continuums, we get the 4 types: intuitive plotter, intuitive pantser, methodological plotter, and methodological pantser. So just to give you a quick idea of what those types are, the intuitive plotter is someone who needs to plan before the first draft, but does so based on intuition or gut feelings, not structural systems or structural sheets. The intuitive pantser is someone who flies by the seat of their pants. They don't do any plotting or planning at all, and they figure out or feel out the plot as they go, as they actually write the first draft. The methodological plotter is someone who needs a very strong grasp of methodology and very strong systems, worksheets, methods for planning. It's a lot more rigid and a lot more logical. The methodological pantser is kind of the wild card, but also I think pretty popular from what you guys have said as a type. So the methodological pantser is someone who needs a strong grasp of the methods or the techniques, yet they tend to have a vision that grows and develops as they work on the story. So they can't just plan everything in advance, but they do depend on those structural systems, character arc components, things like that in order to write, edit, and sort of polish their story. So those are the 4 types. I do recommend that you watch the video on how to determine your type, and also the individual videos on the writing process that works best for each type, because that will really, really help you guys with your writing process, with developing a process that really works for you, and that will help you to really speed up your writing and to actually help you to get to the end of writing a novel. So I will say that many writers idolize a specific type of writer. So this is sort of jumping back a little bit into mindset shifts. If you're the type of person who sort of idealizes the idea of the intuitive pantser, so the person who can sort of sit down and the words just flow out of them and they can just write their masterpiece straight through, that is not a realistic goal for most people. If you can't do that now, you probably won't be able to do that in the future. I know that that sucks, and I know that we all wish that we could just be well, maybe we don't all, but many of us wish that we could be the intuitive pantser who just wings these amazing first drafts, but it's genuinely not a realistic goal for the vast majority of writers. So I would encourage you to let go of that. I know it's hard. There is a small number of writers who also idealize the methodological plotters. So they wish, maybe they're very type A, and they wish that they had that very logical, crisp, clean, laying out all of the components of the plot, laying out all the components of the character arc. They just wish that they could be very systematic in how they write things, but that doesn't work for their brains. Again, it's something that you kind of just have to let go of. I know that it sucks, but if you have these views of a certain type that you really wish that you were, unfortunately, there's really nothing that you can do to get to a point where that works for you. Maybe you could change your type. If any of you have changed your type, I would be curious to hear about that, but I wouldn't count on it, and I would try to work with what works for you now. You may internalize the methodology so that at some point winging it becomes easier, but that doesn't mean you're not still using the methodology. It doesn't really make you intuitive in the traditional sense. So I hope that makes sense. Try to figure out the type that works best for you and the process that works best for you, and try to let go of what you wish you were or what type you want to be. What's most important is the type that you actually are. That's what's going to make the biggest difference in your writing. So the second way to improve your process is to find a schedule that actually works for you. So just like there are different writing types, there are different writing schedules that can be beneficial or detrimental depending on how your brain works and depending on who you are as a person. So there are two different aspects of scheduling that I would recommend that you sort of analyze. The first is whether or not to schedule in the first place. So for some people, having that rigid schedule is vital. So some people, we might never really want to do difficult things. We might never really be in the mood to sit down and work. And maybe having a specific schedule, it forces you to sit down and to actually do the work at specific times. And that could be very beneficial for some people. For other people, they really need to feel inspired in order to do work with any quality whatsoever, work that has any value. So if they were to force themselves to sit down, they really wouldn't get any value in that session. So maybe whatever they would write in that session would just be trash anyway, and there'd be really no point in having done it. So I think it's important to keep in mind that you might fall somewhere in there, and that you should try to schedule if you need it and to not schedule if you don't need it. For some people, passion will draw them to their writing desk very regularly. I think those people are very lucky. They don't fall into the category of the people who need to be forced into a schedule, and they're not the people who sit around waiting for intuition. They just want to do the work. They want to write. Those people are very lucky. If that's you, you really don't need any kind of schedule system at all. And most likely, if you don't need a schedule and you give yourself one anyway, you might end up saving work. So you might end up being on a roll, but you stop because tomorrow you have to sit for an hour and you don't want to not have anything to write about when that happens. So I hope that makes sense. I think sometimes imposing schedules can have a detrimental effect if you don't need one. So the second question to ask yourself is, what length of writing session works best for you? So I shared recently on the Patreon podcast that for me, I really like to work in really, really big chunks. So I would rather sit and work on writing, editing, whether videos, working with other writers, etc. I would rather sit down and work for 5 to 7 hours straight and then take a break for a week than work an hour a day. To me, I can't get into something. I can't really get into like flow state. I can't really wrap my mind around what I'm trying to achieve if I only sit down for 30 minutes or an hour. It just really doesn't work for me. And you might be the type of person that it doesn't work for as well. So if you've never tried this before, I recommend that you try writing for maybe 5 to 7 hours in one day. Or editing. It actually works great for editing because you can get a lot of perspective in one sitting. So maybe try to do that for 1, 2, 3, or 4 days in a row. I know that sounds crazy, but if you can do that and then take a break for a week or 2 or 3, to me that works so much better, and it might work better for you. So that's something you might want to try. On the other hand, of course, there are tons and tons of people who work best in short bursts. So they do better if they only sit with a project for 30 to 60 minutes, or maybe 90 minutes. These people maybe lose perspective easily. So maybe if they spend more time on their project than that, they tend to not be able to really see what they're doing anymore. They remember too much what's in their head and not enough. They're not able to be objective enough about what's actually on the page. So if that's you, you may do better to schedule yourself in for an hour or an hour and a half per session. And working longer may be detrimental even if you want to. So again, I think the problem is often what works best for us is not what we want to do. I think we all idealize or idolize, both idealize and idolize the opposite approach to things. And I think that makes it difficult for a lot of us because we're always trying to make ourselves fit into boxes we don't fit into. Maybe we romanticize other methods a little bit more. I don't know. I think the psychology of that would be interesting to delve into. But so I recommend that you see what works best for you in terms of whether you should schedule or not, and whether to do long or short sessions, because slow and steady wins the race, but sprinting also wins the race. Either way is fine. Just figure out what works best for you. So, and lastly, don't fall into the trap of thinking that you're working more than you actually are. Sometimes I'll have writers time how long they're actually working. So you could use a stopwatch or whatever you want. And every time you get up or you answer an email or you go to the bathroom or you go and get a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or whatever, untime yourself and actually see how long you're truly working on your book. We're looking at a giant project, something that is going to take hundreds of hours to complete. A lot of the time, writers are shocked to find they're actually only spending maybe like 2 hours a week, even though maybe they're sitting at their desk 6 or 7 hours a week. It's very easy to get distracted, and I think writing is such intense work, it can sometimes feel like we've spent more time on it than we actually have. So the third thing that I want you to think about with your writing process is to edit whenever you want. So again, I mentioned this earlier in the video. Technically, the most efficient way to edit is in rounds. So technically, it would be most efficient to write the rough draft all the way through, then edit through the first edited draft. I don't know what my brain is doing right now. So the rough draft, the first true draft, and then the second draft, so on. And then even in that, working big to small. So starting with structure, character arc, big picture, working down until your last round of editing would be line editing. That is technically the most efficient. However, that does not work for many people. The more writers that I talk to, the more I think this maybe doesn't really work that well for anyone, or not anyone, but you know what I mean. It only works for a small number of people who can truly work in rounds of editing in that way, or work in drafts. So if editing works for you at any point, or if you feel the need to edit at any point, I would suggest that you go ahead and do it, because I think that there are a lot of people who truly cannot get perspective on a project that they're not editing. Sometimes trying to sort of build up from a shaky foundation. So say the first 3 chapters are just crap and you know it's crap and you don't like it at all, trying to build up from that and ignore that and say, well, I'm just going to finish this rough draft. I have found for most writers, either it ends up wobbly, it doesn't make sense, they end up throwing out most of that rough draft anyway, or they quit. They cannot get themselves to want to work on it. They can't force themselves to want to work on it. They just don't want to do it because they don't want to look at something like that. And aside from just not wanting to look at it, so there are people, and I tend to be a person who's like that. I don't want to look at an ugly draft. So if I write something and it's crap, I find it stressful. So I would rather take the time to polish it and then still end up deleting it because I don't want to look at it like that. And maybe I'm in the minority, I don't know, but for me, that's how I am. Even with scripts for these videos, I might polish whole sections that I end up deleting, but I don't want to look at it in its like ugly raw form. So there's that. And then there's also people who need to build up their story brick by brick. So if this is especially true for very intuitive people. So if the chapter is really rough and then you need to move on to the next scene, if it doesn't work, so nothing works about this first brick and you're trying to add a brick on top of it, there are people who cannot do that. There are many people who just cannot do that. So you need to polish that first brick so that you know what the second brick is and so that you can sort of slot into the flow and the rhythm of the story. And it may not be possible for some people to do that without editing as they go. So despite the common advice that you should only edit at the end of a rough draft, that you should never edit as you go, I don't agree with that. I think if it's something you want to do, you should do it. I think your time is only your time and all you have to lose is your time. So if you're not super bothered by it, which I would encourage you to, again, we're going to jump back to mindset. I would encourage you to not worry too much about how long it's taking you to do something. Focus on doing what you want, bringing your vision to life. Don't worry so much about how long you're spending on a project. So anyway, despite the common advice, I would recommend to edit as you go if you want to and if you feel like it's working for you. So part 3 is improve your skills. It can be tempting to think of writing as something that we will naturally get better at with practice, that if we just keep doing it, eventually we will get good at it. But that actually isn't the case. And if you've ever maybe sang to your favorite song 1,000 times and you still can't hit those high notes and you still don't sound good singing it, you know that just doing the same thing over and over doesn't inherently make you better. Practicing writing doesn't inherently make you better. In fact, sometimes when we practice the exact same thing over and over, we just dig a deeper and deeper rut of doing it the wrong way, and we ingrain more and more and more in our head the wrong way of doing things. So when you want to improve your skills, I really encourage you to try to identify specifically what you want to improve and work on those specific things instead of just aimlessly practicing, hoping that you will get better. So the first tip is to sharpen your core skills first. So often what writers complain about, when writers come to me complaining that they don't like something about their work, they're usually complaining about secondary skills. So they're usually complaining that they don't like their voice. That's a very common one. That the pacing is bad with their book or that they don't understand pacing. That's pretty common. Their characters are flat or their dialogue is flat. That's pretty common. But all of these things are really secondary skills. They're not the core skills. And I think the problem is that when you focus too much on these secondary skills, you're not focusing on the things that you really need to improve in order to see a big jump up in the quality of your writing. You can practice, say, dialogue over and over and over. You can practice your dialogue until you're blue in the face, but if you don't understand the core of how stories are told and how stories function, you're not going to know what that dialogue should be or how your characters should act. And so your dialogue is never going to be all that good. And you might think that you're bad at dialogue when really it's not even about the dialogue, it's about those core skills. So to me, based on my experience working with writers, I think that there are 5 core skills that are essential to novel writing, and those are story structure, scene structure, the character arc, strong sentences, and cohesive paragraphs. So of course there are tons of secondary skills. I'm not at all saying that you don't need these secondary skills, or that you never need to learn anything in terms of secondary skills, or that you could never be held back by them. I just think that most of those problems either self-resolve when you figure out those 5 core skills, or when you strengthen your core skills, or they become easy to resolve because you have a better understanding of what those secondary skills are for, what they're actually trying to achieve, and how that sort of gels with the core skills that you need. So it can be difficult to even assess your ability with your secondary skills until you have these core skills in place, because the core skill problems can masquerade as secondary skill problems, especially if you don't really know that much about the core skills. So maybe you really struggle to identify how well you're doing at all. You might really have no sense of whether your story is well plotted, because you just don't really understand it well enough to know. So you may be pointing in the wrong direction. Beta readers and critique partners often point to secondary skills as why they don't like a book instead of core skills, because they just don't have the understanding or experience to point out which core skills are not up to par. So that's just something to keep in mind. Additionally, weaknesses in the secondary skills aren't the end of the world. So while of course we would prefer that every book be great in every area, we can all think of books we've read where the characters were pretty flat, but we still really liked the book. Or maybe the voice was very functional, plain, so-so, average, but we absolutely loved the book because it was just so entertaining and so fun. The reason that happens is because those writers understand the core skills. If you nail the core skills, those secondary skills really aren't that big of a deal. While of course we should always be doing the best that we can, and we should always try to improve in every area, often those secondary skills just aren't as important as people make them out to be, or they're not as important as they feel when everything is wrong. So when everything is wrong, the dialogue being bad, for example, might stand out a lot more than it's going to stand out once mostly everything is right. So another reason that I recommend that you guys focus on the core skills, especially when we're talking about improving in 2024 and making big leaps and bounds improvements in 1 year, is that you will see a much bigger increase in the quality of your writing by focusing on core skills than you'll see by focusing on the secondary skills. And I really think that once you see those big improvements happening, it really builds up your confidence, and it really encourages you to keep writing. And that's also a big benefit of the core skills over the secondary skills. You generally aren't going to see overall big improvements if you work on something like writing beautiful descriptions or writing compelling hooks at the beginning of scenes. That's not necessarily going to have that big of an impact on the overall book. Not as much as working on your core skills. Even if you are an intuitive writer most of the time, I would still encourage you to look at the core skills, because most writers who are intuitive, they aren't necessarily intuitive about all of the core skills. So usually there's something that doesn't come naturally. It might be cohesive paragraphs don't come naturally, but story structure comes naturally and the character arc comes naturally. Or it might be writing itself, like the nitty-gritty parts, sentences and paragraphs come really easily to you, but you are not intuitive about story structure. So even if you consider yourself to be generally intuitive as a writer, I would encourage you to still really examine and look at these core skills and to see where you can improve. So my next tip is to identify your weaknesses. So of course, this is not a fun part of writing or a fun part of anything in life, because like thinking about your weaknesses and focusing on your weaknesses is not enjoyable, but it's very, very important to improvement. So how can you identify these areas where you're weak? That is what I really want to go over in this section. And I think this is one of the more important sections in this video. So I'm going to go over the 5 core skills and sort of the symptom sets that you might see with each of those skills if you're weak in that area. So there will be a lot of overlap, because sometimes symptoms can show up for multiple different core skills. So for example, like with dialogue, if you write poor dialogue, that could actually come from the character arc not being strong, which maybe is a little bit more obvious, but it can also come from not understanding scene structure, which is probably a lot less obvious and intuitive. But because symptoms overlap between different weaknesses, try to sort of see which set of weaknesses, what set of symptoms fits you the best. So maybe if you relate to 4 or 5 or 6 different weaknesses for story structure, that's more likely your problem than if you only relate to one of the symptoms or weaknesses relating to the character arc. I hope that makes sense. I just want to clarify there is going to be like some overlap in symptoms between the different core skill weaknesses. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So if you struggle with story structure, here are some of the symptoms that you might experience. So you might get to a certain point in the manuscript and you don't know what should happen next. And this point in the manuscript might be the same every single time that you write. So it might always be around 20% or always around 50%. It tends to be pretty consistent. That's a good sign that you are not understanding one of the major plot points. Or it might be that you understand the first quarter and the last quarter, but the whole middle is just a hot mess in everything that you write, and the middle is always sloppy and jumbled. So that's another good sign that story structure is a weakness. Another sign is that you frequently shuffle scenes around. So when you're editing, you're constantly moving scenes around, or maybe you feel that you could. So if you don't, maybe you know that you could shuffle scenes around. And this is caused by the scenes not feeling rooted where they are. So they're not slotting into the structure strongly enough or cleanly enough that they can't be moved somewhere else. So that's why that's potentially a symptom. So also, you rarely or never develop a functional draft. So you've almost never written a story that could be read beginning to end and makes sense. If this is you, story structure is probably one of your problems. You feel like most of the scenes in the novel are filler, or you feel like you're constantly having to make things up to fill space. That is a good sign that you do not understand story structure. So lastly, you find that the book is easy to put down and not pick back up, or beta readers or critique partners say they get bored and they don't really feel compelled to finish the book. So now moving on to scene structure. If you struggle with scene structure, often you'll find that scenes feel repetitive. So maybe characters are frequently taking similar actions, going to the same locations over and over, or having very similar conversations over and over and over. So there's a lot of repetition going on. The pacing might feel slow or awkward. Again, the book might be easy to put down. There may not be that sense of narrative thrust. There may not be tension. There might not be that feeling of like, oh no, what's going to happen next? If that's something that you really struggle with, scene structure may very well be the cause of that. Readers complain about not understanding the characters, not understanding the characters' actions or the characters' motivations. This might seem like a strictly character-related issue, but it can actually be caused by the scene lacking intention or lacking purpose. Similarly, the dialogue might feel like it serves the plot instead of reflecting a logical underlying goal, or instead of feeling like it has to do with the character's motive. Alternatively, the dialogue might just feel completely disjointed from the plot, even when it's essential to the plot. So it just feels weirdly disconnected, or maybe it feels extremely boring. You might also struggle with starting scenes in an interesting way, or you're just not sure where to start scenes. Maybe you find yourself writing a lot of similar setups to your scenes. So maybe you're frequently describing the weather at the beginnings of scenes, or frequently describing the character waking up or something like that. Additionally, you might also find that endings of scenes sort of fizzle out, or you don't really know when or how to end the scenes. My camera died, so if I look different or the lighting looks different, I had to wait for it to recharge the battery. So anyway, so back to if you struggle with scene structure. So scenes that are essential to the plot somehow still feel pointless or meandering. You like the individual components of the scene, so the dialogue is nice, the descriptions are interesting, the introspection is strong, but when you take it as a whole, it feels scattered, disorganized, disjointed. It just doesn't work, even though all the components are strong. Another sign is that you don't like your voice. Again, this can be counterintuitive, but if you have a structured scene, the narration knows what it needs to narrate. And if you don't have a scene structure, you don't know what needs to be said. So it's really hard to have a strong voice when you don't know what you're trying to say or what you need to say to bring across the scene. So that is all of the scene structure symptoms of weakness. So now let's move on to the character arc. So if you struggle with the character arc, your characters will tend to feel flat or inconsistent. Maybe no matter what you do, you can't really bring them to life, or you can't really make them feel like real people. The actions the protagonist takes don't make sense. So maybe you feel like you're constantly pushing the protagonist to do things that they just don't want to do, but you don't really know why, or you want a scene to go a certain way, but it feels really forced. You might also find that you're really justifying action. So you might constantly be explaining why the character is doing what they're doing because the story doesn't speak for itself, or it doesn't make inherent sense. The readers might complain about not understanding the characters, or they might complain about not understanding the characters' actions or why they do what they do, or they might not understand their motivation. They might not be able to relate to the character. This could be that the actions feel illogical to the reader, or it could be more so that the emotions feel illogical, or maybe the emotions of the character feel out of proportion or disconnected from what's going on. The dialogue feels weak or inconsistent, so maybe you're struggling to make the dialogue feel like it came from the same character every time, so it doesn't feel cohesive. It could be that the dialogue feels sort of like you're putting words in the character's mouth, so it feels more like you're trying to make the character say something rather than that the character would authentically say that thing. Another really big sign is that the character arc feels tacked on in the end. So it feels like suddenly there's this big growth in the end, and it doesn't really feel like you built to that in a logical way. It might also feel like the shift is really abrupt, or that it comes out of nowhere, or that readers couldn't have really predicted that this would be the arc. And the reader doesn't always need to be able to predict the arc, but if it feels very random or it feels very out of nowhere, that's a good sign that you don't understand the arc very well. You feel like you're making up reasons for the character to not have their character arc from the beginning. So if the lesson would be relatively easy to learn and there isn't a good reason that the character isn't learning it, you might feel like you're constantly trying to justify or make up reasons that this character doesn't just have their growth from the very beginning. The voice, especially in first and third, you're not really going to see this as much being a problem in Omniscient. It will feel weak or inconsistent, basically because you're needing to go into the voice of that character. If the character arc isn't in place, you won't really have enough depth and complexity to the character to easily have a strong voice. So you'll probably then see problems with the voice. So the next thing is strong sentences. So if you struggle with strong sentences, the writing will tend to sound clunky or awkward, or it simply just doesn't sound professional. You can tell when you read it, it doesn't sound like the way a professional would write. It might also be that it has a children's book sound. So there's almost like a child quality to the writing, even though you're trying to write a book for adults. So that can be a common way that it might manifest, so your writing feels very juvenile. Emotions feel melodramatic even when the scene warrants strong emotion. So even when you know this is a very big emotional scene, it still feels really silly or melodramatic or goofy, or it's hard to take the emotions seriously. The action feels distant or far away, so it feels like there's this big separation between the reader and the character's experience and how the character's experiencing the action or what the character is feeling. The readers might struggle to get into the character's shoes, or they might say that they don't feel any tension or that they're not able to connect with the stakes. Descriptions and actions are difficult to visualize, so it's hard to imagine what's going on. It's hard to create a mental picture. Readers might complain that they don't understand what you're describing, or that they had a hard time following certain aspects of the book. You rely a lot on tropes or cliches. I think this is pretty obvious. If you're past like absolute beginner, it's unlikely that you're relying too much on tropes and cliches, but you might still be relying too much on expected or generic descriptions. So certain descriptions just feel very typical or expected. They lack a sense of voice. For example, big bushy beard, cozy blanket, shiny diamond. These are just very generic, typical descriptions, and that can really weaken your writing. So anyway, there's sort of a lack of uniqueness or a lack of authenticity. Lastly, is you just don't like your voice. This is pretty obvious, pretty common with poor sentence quality. It's a very common reason that you don't like your voice, because a lot of the time, even if you can get the personality into the writing, so you do have a personality with your voice, if the sentences are weak, that can really undermine it. So if you relate to the other symptoms of weak sentences, that might be the reason that you're struggling with your voice. Lastly, if you struggle with cohesive paragraphs, descriptions will feel like they're just stuck in, they're just put there to be there. So you might have a lot of descriptions in the book, but they just sort of feel pointless. They're not really contributing anything. It might also be that you don't have a lot of descriptions in the book because you don't know what to describe or why. So that can also be a sign that you're struggling with paragraph cohesion. Actions feel like stage directions. So there's a this happened, then this happened, then this happened quality to the writing. So it's hard to get immersed in the action. It feels very much like you're just describing the movements the way that a stage direction would be described. Readers struggle to understand the point of your paragraphs, of your descriptions, or of entire scenes. They're just having a hard time with things clicking. Things just aren't clicking for readers. This might be a little bit harder to suss out because you're unlikely to really ask readers, especially on a paragraph level, did you understand this paragraph? Did you understand this paragraph? As a result, you might not realize that it's the paragraphs that are confusing the readers, that they're not picking up on the messages in the paragraphs, or that you're not sending clear messages in the paragraph. So that can be a little bit trickier. You might also find when you reread your own work that you find it boring, or that you don't understand your own intention. So you're not really sure what you meant when you wrote something. That can obviously be a sentence level problem, but often it's a lack of cohesion in the paragraphs. You might be wondering, why did I even include this in the first place? What was my brainwave? What was going on in my head when I wrote this? That can be a problem with paragraph cohesion. Again, you don't like your voice. That sort of comes up with everything. So that's why you have to sort of look at the other symptoms as well. So once you have good sentences and you have good scene structure, you know what you want to convey, but the paragraph is where you might fail to actually convey it. It might be where it's not tying together. So you might have strong sentences, but the paragraphs aren't tying those sentences together to create a meaning, to create a message to the reader. And in that case, often the voice, it needs to have more mastery over the information. So it needs to feel like you're curating this information and organizing the information with intention and with a sense of purpose and clarity with what you're trying to achieve. Your writing might generally feel disorganized. It might feel like you can shuffle paragraphs around when you're editing, and it doesn't really matter what order they're in. It doesn't really change the flow of the scene very much, or the paragraphs don't really fit into the flow of the scene very well. You might also struggle to bring across messages without directly stating it. So you might find that you rely on telling because you're not really able to bring across your messages without telling. So you're not really able to imply things. You're not able to use the paragraphs to create subtext or to create a message without stating what you're trying to bring across. And that's pretty much it for cohesive paragraphs. That's pretty much it for all of the 5 core types. So those are the types of symptoms that you can look at to see which of those things maybe you want to put the most attention on this year as you're trying to improve. So hopefully that helped. I have many videos about all of these topics, so I'm going to put links in the description so you can reference those based on what you think might be a weakness for you, or maybe you just want to check them all out. But I think those 5 core skills will really help you to just jump your ability up way beyond what you thought you could achieve in a year if you really dig in and work on those core skills. So the last tip for improving your skills and for the whole video is fix it in post. So sometimes as writers and probably artists of any type, really, we can feel a lot of pressure to get things right on the first try. We can feel a lot of pressure that everything has to come out perfectly and beautifully every single time. But that's not realistic. So realistically, our rough drafts are going to be ugly and they're going to have a lot of problems, and they're going to be things that don't come naturally to us and that never are going to come naturally to us. And as frustrating as that might be, and as much as we'd like to think that if we build up our skills, some of it will become more natural, and that is probably true, there are always going to be ugly, sloppy, messy parts of the first draft, and there are always going to be things that you're not very good at. And it's important to keep in mind that you can fix things in post, because we can edit our novels before anybody else has to see it. We don't have to rely on what we can do the first time. And for some people, that's going to look like rewriting the same scene 12 times, or it's going to look like reworking the dialogue until it really, really sounds natural. But it might mean that your first draft always has clunky, messy, awkward dialogue, and that might not be something that ever really completely changes for you. You can and should give those areas extra attention when you're editing, so it's very good to be aware of it. And this is where weakness in those secondary skills really is pretty easy to overcome with line editing, because if you're aware of it, you get everything else into place. You can fix it in post. You can fix it when you go through those editing phases, and you can really bring it up to a publishable level. So being a good writer is more about being a good editor. I guarantee you that barring a few very, very, very lucky individuals, writers, including published writers, are writing really, really bad first drafts, really embarrassing first drafts that they would not let anyone see, maybe their editor if they really trust their editor, but I assure you, they are writing humiliatingly bad first drafts. So the first draft is part of the process, and we can fix things in post, and we should fix things in post, and we should be editing those areas where we're not strong, but we should not be feeling bad about ourselves or stressing out when something doesn't look good in the first draft, because that is completely normal. It's a normal, expected part of the process, and that is for everyone. A big part of creating good art is pushing through the ugly phase and not letting that ugly phase feel like it's reflecting on you or bringing you down or making you want to give up. But also, editing is the most important part, and we should not be just resting on whatever we achieve in the first draft. We should be editing those areas where we know we're weak, not ignoring them, really working at them. And that might mean you're always weak in the same thing, and you're always spending your editing time focusing on the same thing. You might have perfect story structure in your first draft, but you might have really weak characters every single time in every single book, in every single project, and you always have to bring those characters to life in the editing phase, and that's completely normal, and it's completely fine. So that is all for this video. I know that was a lot to go over, but I wanted to create sort of a roadmap for how you could improve in 2024. I really hope that you found all these tips helpful. I do go over most of this stuff in more depth in other videos, so I recommend checking that out if you feel stuck or confused by anything. I will be back with a new video, I believe, at the end of this month. If all goes well, I'm going to do a collaboration with an agent. So if that interests you, subscribe and you'll get notified when that video comes out. If you want to help support the channel, I have a Patreon. If you can afford it, you have some expendable income and you want to help support the channel, I really, really appreciate that. We have some exclusive videos on there, a Q&A podcast that I do every other week, and some worksheets and other things, some structure sheets, things like that on there if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, I completely understand. Please never put yourself in a financially compromised position to support somebody else. Take care of yourself and your needs. I will say, if you do want to help but you can't help financially, sharing these videos really helps to spread them. YouTube has not really been giving my videos to people recently, so if you share them, that really helps me out. And of course, liking, subscribing, all of that stuff, and commenting and all that. So thank you all so much for watching and for sticking with me through this very long and somewhat strange video with no set. And I'm sure I look like I was recently sick as well, so there's really no aesthetic appeal to this video, but thank you all for sticking with me, and I hope you all have a great 2024 where you make incredible improvements in your writing. And if you have any suggestions for video topics you want to see in 2024, please also let me know in the comments, because I'm always looking for good ideas, especially good doable ideas, because sometimes some of my videos just take so long to produce, and so I'm always looking for things that are a little bit faster so I can make more videos for you guys. But I will still do deep dives in 2024 as well. Let me know what you want to see, and in the meantime, happy writing, guys.